So here's a question that might make you uncomfortable. If Kenya is a democracy, and a democracy means the people get to choose their leaders, why does it feel like no matter who we elect, the same things keep happening? I mean, think about it. We've had Kenyatta, we've had Moi, Kibaki, Uhuru, and now we have Ruto. Different faces, different parties, different promises. And yet, somehow the roads are still terrible, the hospitals lack medicine, public schools still crumble, but government procurement contracts, those are thriving. In fact, they're doing better than ever, which raises an even more uncomfortable question. What if elections aren't really about you choosing leaders? What if they're about something else entirely? What if by the time you walk into that voting booth, the important decisions have already been made, and not by voters, but by people with enough money to make sure they win regardless of who you pick? Today we're going to talk about something Kenyan media doesn't like discussing in detail, even though everyone suspects it's true. The tycoons who fund our politics. Not as a conspiracy theory, not as speculation, but as a system. A perfectly logical, highly profitable system that works exactly as it's designed to. And once you see how it works, you can't ever unsee it. So let's begin. And welcome back to the Kenyan Week That Was. I'm your host, DY. Let's start with a simple question. How much does it actually cost to win an election in Kenya? Now, if you ask the Electoral Commission, they'll tell you there are legal spending limits. For a presidential candidate, the official limit is around 4.4 billion shillings. For a governor, it's about 400 million. And for an MP, around, give or take, 33 million. Which sounds reasonable, I suppose. Until you realize that these numbers are adorable in their irrelevance. Because here's what actually happens. Those limits are routinely, systematically, extravagantly ignored. Presidential campaigns in Kenya cost between 5 and 10 billion shillings. Gubernatorial race, try about 500 million to 2 billion Kenya shillings. A parliamentary seat, you ask? More so in a competitive constituency, that goes for anywhere around 50 to 200 million shillings. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but these guys are rich. People running for office are rich. And maybe they're just spending their own money. Come on, DY. And to that I say, let's do the math. Let's take a typical gubernatorial candidate. According to their official wealth declaration, that thing they are legally required to file, they might be worth, say, 500 million shillings. Properties, businesses, investments, 500 million, not bad. But then they spend 2 billion shillings on their campaign. Now, I'm not a mathematician, and neither do I repute myself to be one, but I do know that 2 billion is significantly larger than 500 million. In fact, it's 1.5 million shillings larger. Which means that somehow, this candidate found a whopping 1.5 billion shillings that they apparently didn't have by the time they were declaring. Where did it come from? Did it fall from the sky? Was there a generous uncle that they had? Did they win the lottery or sport pesa 3 times in a row and just forgot to mention it in their wealth declaration? No, my guy. No. What happened is simpler and far more important. Someone else paid for it. And here's the thing about someone else paying for your campaign. They are not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They are not funding you because they believe in democracy. They are doing it because campaigns in Kenya aren't donations. They are investments. And like any investment, the people making them expect a healthy return on their investment. Think about it this way. If I give you 2 billion shillings to become governor, I'm not giving you a gift. I'm giving you a loan, an unwritten, undocumented, utterly enforceable loan. And the interest rate you ask, that's negotiated later. In the form of regulatory favors, in the form of you answering my phone calls for the next 5 years without ever imagining that you could ignore while you're ignoring everybody else's. This isn't bribery. It's not even corruption as we usually imagine it. It's capital bargaining through elections. A system where money doesn't break democracy. It actually replaces it. And this is how it works. Let me break it down for you guys. Politicians in Kenya are not self-funded candidates. They are borrowers. They borrow money from the people who have it, then use that money to win, and then they spend the entire term paying it back, not with cash, but with access to the state. And that's just one campaign. Now imagine your tycoon with serious money. You know, the real rich people in Kenya. You're not funding just one candidate. You're funding several. Maybe you're funding a presidential candidate and a couple of other governors and a few MPs. You're building a portfolio. Which brings us to the very next question. Why would you fund multiple candidates in the first place? Why not just pick the guy you think will win and go all in? Well, because that would be astronomically stupid. And whatever else these people are, they are not stupid. Here's something fascinating about Kenyan political finance. The same names keep showing up, not as candidates, as funders across decades, across parties, across ideologies, or what passes for ideology in Kenyan politics. You'll see business families and corporate interests that funded KANU in the 90s, also funding NAC in 2002. You'll see the same people, the same names who funded PNU in 2007, also funding ODM. The same interests back in Jubilee in 2013 had connections to CORD. And today, the same tycoons are hedging between UDA or Kenya Kwanza and whatever political outfit that will become our very next opposition. Now, if you are a normal person, this seems completely insane. If you believed in Raila's vision, why would you have also funded Ruto? If you thought Ruto was the answer, why are you also cutting checks for the next opposition leader that we don't know yet, the Gachagwas of today? But here's the thing, these people don't care about vision. They care about access. And the smartest way to guarantee access is to make sure that no matter who wins, you already paid for a seat at that glorious table. This is called hedging. It's what inventors do when they don't want to lose. You don't put all your money in one stock or one basket for that matter. You diversify. You spread your bets, because if you own a piece of everything, then ladies and gentlemen, you can never lose. Now apply that to politics. If you fund both the government and the opposition, you're not taking a risk. You're buying insurance. Political insurance, that is. When candidate A wins, you call them. When candidate B wins, you call them. Either way, your call will forever get answered. And let me give you an example, not naming names, but describing the system, because the system is what matters. In 2013, there was significant business interest tied to both Jubilee and CORD campaigns. Banking sector players, real estate developers, infrastructure contractors. After the election, regardless of who won, what happened to the banking regulations? They stayed favorable. What happened to the non-performing loans that should have triggered serious consequences? They were handled gently. And right now what it brings to mind is one of the series that Juan Morara Kebaso has been running on his social platforms, where he speaks about this company that has been that was awarded one of the sugar mill companies in Kenya, despite them having borrowed from the Consolidated Agricultural Fund or something, and to a tune of 184 million, which they've never paid a penny. Imagine. And guess what? What has happened to them? They were awarded a new business. Like I've said, they are handled gently. What happened to meaningful financial sector reform? Nothing happened. Because when the same money funds both sides, there's no such thing as an opposition. There's just different branding. And here's where it gets darkly funny. We, the voters, we perform this whole ritual of democracy. We fight on Twitter. We argue with our relatives. We wear party colors. We treat elections like they're existential battles between good and evil. Meanwhile, the people who actually paid for both campaigns are having lunch together in Muthaiga. They're laughing because they know something we are only starting to figure out now. The fight is fake, but the profits are real. So what are those profits exactly? What do these investors get for their money, you ask? I'm glad that now you're asking. Let's talk about what happens after the election. Your candidate has won. You've spent 2 billion shillings getting them into office. Now what? Well, now it's time to get paid. And there are so many ways to get paid. It's actually beautiful in a horrifying sort of way. Let me walk you through some of the greatest hits. First, government contracts. This is a classic, the tried and true, the bread and butter of political investment. You fund a campaign, your candidate wins, and suddenly, miraculously, your company starts winning government tenders. Road construction, hospital supplies, IT systems, security services. Doesn't matter what industry you're in, there's a tender that is curated just for you. Now, these contracts are technically awarded through a competitive process. There are procurement rules, there's paperwork, there are committees. It looks very official, but here's the thing. When you have the right phone number, when you know which official to call, when your company's name is on the friendly list, those rules become, let's call it, flexible. Wink, wink. You know that road in your constituency? The one they rebuild every 2 years? The one where the contractor shows up, lays fresh tarmac, collects payments, and then 18 months later, the potholes are back? And we're told we need emergency repairs? That's not incompetence. That's a feature. Because every time that road gets rebuilt, someone gets paid. And that someone who gets paid is usually the someone who happened to fund the campaign of the someone who approved the contract, or someone who knows the guy in power, because they get the opportunity to choose and make one phone call and decide that this contractor is going to come from this company. And the beauty of it all, the absolute genius of it, is that contract and those contracts are actually legal. You're not bribing anyone. You're just winning tenders, aren't you? The fact that you win every tender and the fact that your bids are somehow always just slightly lower than your competitors, and the fact that the specifications seem weirdly tailored to what your company actually offers, well, that's just good business, isn't it? But wait, because there's more. Secondly, regulatory capture. Let's say you are in the telecommunication industry or banking or energy for that matter. You don't just need contracts. You need favorable regulations. You need the Communications Authority to be understanding about a spectrum allocation. You need the central bank to be gentle about capital requirements. You need the Energy Regulatory Commission to be flexible about its tariffs. So what do? You fund campaigns. And then when your candidate wins, you suggest very politely, very professionally that, they might want to appoint someone reasonable to head the regulatory body. Someone who understands business. Someone a little more pragmatic. Someone who, by pure coincidence, used to work for your company's law firm. And just like that, regulations that might have cost you billions in compliance, they get adjusted, delayed, reinterpreted. It's not corruption, it's just good governance, business-friendly governance. Thirdly, tax exemptions and waivers. Every year, the Kenyan Revenue Authority grants billions of shillings in tax exemptions, sometimes to encourage investment, correctly so, sometimes to support struggling industries. Absolutely amazing. Sometimes because politically connected companies called and said we are going through a tough time and we need a little help. And the government, in its infinite wisdom, always agrees. A tax waiver here, an exemption there, a special arrangement for this particular shipment. Come on. We're helping. Nothing illegal whatsoever. Just discretionary use of executive powers. The results? Companies that have funded campaigns pay a lower effective tax rate than the small business owners struggling to keep their hardware shop open. But that's just how the market works, right? It's not us, it's how the market is trying to balance itself. Fourth, privatization deals. And here's a fun one because we are currently going through this actual phase today. The government decides that, we need to sell a couple of our state assets. Maybe it's land, maybe it's utility, maybe it's a parastatal that has been running at a loss or a profit for that matter. They hire consultants to do a valuation. They announce a bidding process and then shockingly, the winning bid comes from a company with deep ties to the current administration or comes from a country friendly to the current administration. The asset, which was valued at 10 billion shillings by independent assessors, or for that matter, quote unquote, a higher value by independent assessors, somehow gets sold for an odd 3 billion shillings. The explanation, you ask? People, the market wasn't favorable. And we needed to move quickly. And my personal favorite, this was the only serious offer. And the company that bought it, they restructure, wait for a few years, flip it for 15 billion. And that's a 400% return. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not bad for political investment. It's pure bliss for anyone that takes time to fund our so-called democratic elections. Fifth, debt guarantees. And this one's subtle, but it's devastating. Let's say you are a politically connected business and you want to borrow money for a big project. Wink, wink, and cue in Morara Kebaso with the sugar story. The banks are nervous because the project is risky. So what do? You get the government to guarantee the loan. Or you get to give out security that is so insignificant compared to the amount of money that you're actually requiring or requesting to get from the banks. If the project succeeds, you keep all the profits. If it fails, the taxpayer covers the loss. Heads you win, tails we lose. It's the most beautiful scam in capitalism, and it happens all the time. Now, let's do some math because the math is important. Let's say you invest 2 billion shillings in a campaign. Over the next 5 years, you secure, a 20 billion shilling infrastructure contract at 30% markup, 6 billion profit. A favorable regulatory environment that saves you 3 billion in compliance cost, you've made another 3 billion. A tax waiver worth 2 billion. A privatization deal that eventually nets you 5 billion. That's a total of 16 billion shillings in return on a 2 billion investment. That's 700% return over 5 years. People, show me any legitimate investment that gives you such numbers. I'm waiting. Because you can't. Because such numbers don't exist logistically or legally. This is why political finance in Kenya is extremely profitable. It's not corruption in the traditional sense. It's a designed system of legal wealth extraction. And the people who designed it are the same people who unfortunately benefit from it. Which brings us to an obvious question. If this system is so obvious, so well known, why doesn't anyone talk about it? Why doesn't the media investigate? Why don't journalists name names and follow the money? Well, let's talk about that. Here's a thought. A thought experiment. Imagine you own a media company. Let's say it's one of the big ones. You know, you've got newspapers, TV stations, radio, digital platforms. You employ hundreds of journalists. You pride yourself on editorial independence. You run stories about corruption, about government waste, about the failures of leadership. Now, imagine that you personally, or your family, or your company also happens to be deeply invested in Kenyan politics. Maybe you funded a few campaigns. Maybe you have business interests that depend on government contracts. Maybe your board includes people with ties to multiple administrations. Here's the question. Are you going to let your journalists investigate you? Are you going to let them dig into your political investments? Are you going to publish stories about how your companies benefited from the campaign you helped fund? Of course not. That would be insane. And this is our problem in Kenya media sector. It's not that these journalists do not want to investigate political finance. It's that the people who own the media houses are often the same people who finance politics. And let me be clear, I'm not saying every media house is compromised. I'm not saying every editor is taking orders. What I'm saying is that there is a structural conflict of interest built into the system. When the people who own the newspaper are also the people funding campaigns, there are certain stories that just never get told. Not because of a conspiracy, but because of the incentives they receive. Think about it. If you're a journalist at a major media house and you want to investigate political finance, where do you start? You start by looking at who funds campaigns, isn't it? And pretty quickly you'll notice that some of those names are very familiar. Because, they are your shareholders or your advertisers or one of your boss's friends. And suddenly your editor is asking questions. Do we really need this story, sir? Is this the right time? Are you sure about your sources? And before you know it, that story is killed and long gone. Not because it was untrue, but because it was inconvenient. But wait, because it gets better. Because even if the media house is willing to publish, there's another problem. Advertising. The Kenyan government is one of the largest advertisers in the country, if not the largest. Ministries, parastatals, state corporations, they spend billions of shillings on advertising every year. And where does that money go? Take my guess. You and I know of the rumors that run about media houses that have been cut off from the government's advertising cycles. Now, if you're a media house and you publish a story that really, really pisses off the government, what do you think happens to your government advertising contracts? Need I say more? They disappear. Suddenly, the Ministry of Health is placing ads in your competitor's newspaper. The National Treasury stops buying airtime on your station, and your investment or your revenue drops by a 30% margin. So you have a choice now. Publish the truth and lose money, or stay quiet and stay profitable. Most media houses will always choose profitability, not because they are evil, not because they don't want to stand on the side of truth, but because At the core of it all, they're businesses. And they need revenue. And that revenue is actually to help them survive. This is why investigative journalism on political finance in Kenya is so rare. When it happens, it's actually because the story is so big, so internationally embarrassing that silence is no longer an option. Think about NYS, think Anglo Leasing, think Goldenberg. Those stories didn't break because the media suddenly grew a spine. They broke because the evidence became too overwhelming to actually ignore. And the international pressure made it impossible for all of them to stay silent. But everyday corruption, the routine, systematic looting that happens in procurement offices and regulatory bodies across the country, that will forever go unreported because the people who would report it are employed by the people who actually benefit off of it. And here's the really dark part. We, the audience, we, the populace, we know this, and we know the media is compromised. We know they're not telling us the whole story, but we still watch, we still read, we still share the articles on WhatsApp groups because what else are we going to do? Where else are we going to get our information? So the system perpetuates itself. The media doesn't investigate the tycoons who fund politics because the media is owned by the tycoons who fund politics. Again, I repeat, the media doesn't investigate tycoons who fund politics because the media is owned by the tycoons who fund politics. And we pretend not to notice. Because noticing would mean confronting the fact that we don't actually have a free press. We have a privately owned press, and those are not the same thing, which brings us to the biggest question of all. If the same people fund all the campaigns, and the same people own all the media, and the same people win all the contracts, why does policy never change? Why does it feel like no matter who we elect, the system stays exactly the same? The answer is simpler than you think. Here's a concept that will change how you see Kenyan politics. The permanent government. So what's a permanent government? It's the group of business elites, families, tycoons, corporate interests who remain constant even as politicians rotate in and out of office. Presidents come and go, parties rise and fall, cabinets get reshuffled, but the permanent government, they're forever there, in the background, making calls, shaping policy, extracting value. Think of it this way. Politicians are like tenants. They occupy State House, they sit in Parliament, they run ministries, but they do not own the house. The permanent government owns the house. And as you know, the house always wins. So politicians just rent it for 5 years at a time. And when their lease is up, the landlords remain the same. Now, if you're part of the permanent government and you funded campaigns across multiple parties, multiple election cycles, what happens to policy? It converges. It has to, because no matter who wins, they owe you. And when everyone owes you, you do not need to worry about ideology or party platforms or campaign promises. You just need to make sure that the fundamentals remain the same. Let me show you how and what I actually mean. Tax policy. Across every administration, be it KANU, NARC, PNU, Jubilee, Kenya Kwanza, tax policy in Kenya has consistently favored capital over labor. Corporate tax rates have been reduced or held steady. Special economic zones offer exemption, but pay, that keeps going up. VAT, that keeps expanding. The burden on taxation shifts downwards onto workers and small businesses, while the big players get carve-outs and exemptions. Why, you ask? Because the people who fund campaigns don't want to pay taxes. And since they funded the government obliges. Land policy. Despite decades and decades of promises to address historical land injustices, to redistribute idle land, to crack down on land grabbing. Nothing fundamental has changed. Large-scale ownership remains protected. Squatters get evicted. Public lands get grabbed by politically connected individuals. Why? Because the permanent government owns land, and a lot of land, and they are not about to let policy threaten them. Labor laws. Kenya's labor protections are weak. Unions have been systematically undermined. Casual labor is rampant. Workers have limited recourse when they are exploited. Why? Because strong labor laws are expensive for businesses. And the people who own these businesses are the same people who funded the government. Financial sector regulation. Despite repeated banking crises, interest rates capping controversies, and scandals involving non-performing loans, financial sector regulations remain remarkably gentle. Banks are rarely held accountable. Executives walk away from collapses with golden parachutes. Why? Because the banking sector funds politics heavily, and nobody bites the hand that actually feeds them. Public services. Schools, hospitals, roads, these remain chronically underfunded. Meanwhile, government procurement budgets balloon. Why? Because there is no money to be made in maintaining a public school, but there is massive money to be made in building a new road, or supplying hospital equipment, or installing an IT system for your new SHA. So that's where the money goes, not to services, to contracts. Do you see the pattern? Do you? Policy doesn't change because the people who write the checks don't want for it to change. They've designed a system that works for them. They've paid for politicians who will maintain that very system. This is why reformist candidates always disappoint. It's not because they're lying. It's because even if they are sincere, even if they genuinely want change, they are trapped. They owe their seats to people who do not want any form of reform. And if they push too hard, then guess what happens? The money dries up. Case in point, the retired Chief Justice Maraga's campaign has come to a halt because, even the media turns against them. The next election, even before the real election takes place, they're gone. And someone more compliant will always be available to take their place. This means that Kenya doesn't have a corruption problem. And I say that very generously because we also do. We actually have a state capture problem. That thing that President Ruto kept on singing before the 2022 election? It's true. Kenya has a state capture problem. The state has been captured by private interests, and those interests have designed a system where they extract wealth legally, systematically, and perpetually. And here's the most depressing part. This isn't a unique phenomena to Kenya only. This has happened in country after country throughout history. In the United States, during the Gilded Age, robber barons like Rockefeller and Carnegie funded both Republicans and Democrats. They didn't care who won. They owned the system. It took decades of mark-cracking journalism, mass labor movements, and progressive political organizing to break that stronghold. And I bet it's not even broken fully. In South Korea, the massive family-owned conglomerates controlled politics for decades. It took the collapse of a dictatorship and massive public protests to start breaking that fusion of business and state. And even today, it's not fully broken. In many Latin American countries, oligarchic families have controlled politics over centuries. Same families, different parties, same outcomes. The point The point is, this is a design problem, not a personnel problem. You can't fix it by electing different presidents. You can't fix it by being a voting nation. Neither can you fix it by voting harder, because the system is working exactly as it was designed to work for the people who sadly designed it. So now the question becomes, can the system be broken? Is there a way out even? Or are we doomed forever? And the answer is complicated. Let's be honest about something. Breaking this system is really, really hard. I'm not going to lie to you and say that there's a simple solution. I'm not even going to tell you that if we just select the right person, or pass the right law, or protest hard enough, everything will change. Because here's the problem. The people who would have to pass reforms are the same people who've benefited from the same current system. You're asking politicians who got into office because of campaign finance to pass campaign finance reforms. That's oxymoronic. You are asking media houses owned by tycoons to investigate the same tycoons that own the media houses. You're asking a government funded by elite interests to regulate elite interests. Sounds like a freaking joke. It's like asking a fish to regulate water. The fish doesn't even see the water. It's just environment. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means change requires something more than good intentions. It requires either external pressure or an internal fracture. Let me explain what I mean. You see, external pressure means crisis. It means something getting so bad that the system can't hold. It means mass movements. It means international leverage. It means the cost of maintaining status quo becomes higher than the cost of reform. Think about how campaign finance reform happened in the United States. It didn't happen because politicians suddenly became ethical. It happened because macro-king journalists spent decades exposing corruption, because labor movements organized millions of workers, because public outrage reached a tipping point where politicians had no choice but to act. Think about how South Korea broke the tribal politics fusion. It didn't happen through elections. It happened because a dictatorship actually collapsed, because students filled the streets, because the entire system became illegitimate. Internal fracture means elite defections. It means someone inside the system breaks ranks. Someone who knows how it works, who has benefited from it, but who decides for whatever reason, for whatever goddamn given reason, they are willing to burn it all down. Maybe they're motivated by genuine principle. Maybe they got screwed by their fellow elites and want revenge. Maybe they see the writing on the wall and want to be on the right side of history. But I'm not going to lie to you, this is rare. But it happens. And when it does, it can be devastating, because insiders have the receipts. They know where the money came from. They know who called who. They know which contracts were rigged and how they were rigged. So what would actual reform look like? Not vague, let's fight corruption rhetoric, but specific structural changes. Campaign finance caps with criminal enforcement. Right now, spending limits exist on paper but mean nothing in practice. Real reform would mean hard caps, criminal penalties for violations, forensic audits of every major campaign, and jail time for both the candidate who overspend and the donors who overfund. Not fines, jail time. Because the only way to make rich people follow the rules is to make breaking the rules more expensive than actually following them. Secondly, public financing of election. This is radical though. But it's the only way to break the cycle. The state funds campaigns. Private donations are banned entirely, completely, blanket-wise. Every qualified candidate gets the same exact amount of money. That's what they have to work with. That given amount of money. Nothing more, nothing less. No tycoons, no corporate interests, just public money. Because you know what that will mean? It will mean public accountability. An actual competition based on ideas rather than cash. And yes, I'm not foolish. This is expensive. And for a country that is already bogged and dying of overtaxation, taxpayers would have to fund it. And it would be painful. But here's the thing. We're already paying for campaigns regardless. We're just paying for them indirectly through inflated contracts and regulatory capture and tax exemptions. Public financing would actually be cheaper in the long run. And it would give us something we haven't had in decades. An actual, say it with me, actual choice. Thirdly, media ownership diversity laws. Limit media concentration, require disclosure of political investment by media owners, create firewall between ownership and editorial, and make it illegal for someone who funds campaigns to own more than one minority stake in a media company. These, unfortunately, would be fought viciously. Media owners would scream about press freedom and government overreach. But here's the thing. Press freedom doesn't mean rich people can own all the media and use it to protect their interests. It means the public has access to diverse, independent information. And right now, we have neither. Fourthly, procurement transparency systems. Every government contract above a certain threshold gets posted online in real time. Full bidding process, full documentation, full disclosure of company ownership and political ties. Use blockchain if you have to. Make it technically impossible to hide. And here's the key. Make the data accessible, not buried in PDFs on government websites that crashes half the time. Make it searchable, make it analyzable. Let civil society, journalists, let angry citizens dig through it and find the damning patterns. Fifth, empower audit institution. The Office of the Auditor General does a good and brilliant, absolutely magnificent job. But they have no teeth. They publish reports showing billions of shillings stolen and nothing happens. Why? Because they can't prosecute. They can only recommend. They can only say, by the way, our people, Kenyans, our money is being stolen. This guy said they spent, there's a guy who said they spent some freaking amount of money on soda. What happened, you ask? The Senate listened, they had one of these talks, but nothing conclusive. So, give them prosecutorial power. Give them the budget. Give them budget independence. Give them protection from political interference and let them do their jobs. Now, here's the brutal truth. None of this will happen easily. It may not even happen at all, because the people who would lose from all these reforms are the people who are currently controlling the system, and they're not going to give up power voluntarily. So, reform, when it comes, or if it comes, will not be granted from above. It will be forced from below. Through crisis, through pressure, through the system finally collapsing under the weight of its own corruption, or through the citizens organizing in ways that make maintaining the status quo more expensive than changing it. But here's what I know for certain. You can't fight what you cannot see. And that is why this conversation actually matters. Not because it offers easy solutions, not because it gives you or gives us as a country simple actions or simple action plans, but because it makes the invisible finally visible. It's like peering the darkness with a freaking torchlight and actually being able to see the damning criminal that is stood in your corner, in the corner of your house. So, let me tell you what just happened here. You came to this video probably searching for names. You wanted to know who funds Kenyan politics. You wanted a list, a smoking gun, something concrete to point at and say, there is our problem. But what you got instead was something more important. You got the architecture, the system, the machine that runs underneath all the theater we call democracy. You now understand. You now clearly understand that campaigns cost billions more than candidates have. You understand the same tycoons fund multiple candidates as hedging strategy. And you understand that political investment generates returns of over 700% through contracts, regulatory capture, tax exemptions, and privatization deals. You also understand that the media sadly won't investigate this because the media is owned by the same people who benefit from all of this. You sadly understand that policy never changes because the permanent government, the people who fund everyone, do not want it to change even a little bit. You finally understand that what you call corruption is actually just the payout mechanism for political investment. This is not a conspiracy. This is not speculation. This is how the system actually works. And this is how it has always and always will work. And here's the thing about seeing the machine. You can never unsee it. You cannot claim that you do not know. You cannot remain in your state of bliss and ignorance. Because from now henceforth, every election, you'll see it differently. When candidates promise change, you'll wonder who paid for their campaigns. When a new government announces reforms, you'll ask, who do they owe? When a procurement scandal breaks, you'll recognize it not as a failure of the system, but as the system working exactly as designed. When media coverage seems strangely muted on certain topics, now you know, and you'll always know why. The machine will now be visible to you in ways it wasn't before. And that visibility, that knowing is dangerous. Not to you, to them, to all these tycoons and politicians hedging against us as a nation, because the system depends on our ignorance. It depends on us believing that elections are about ideas when they are really about investment. It depends on us fighting each other over ethnicity and personalities while they laugh all the way to treasury. It depends on all of us thinking that if we just vote harder, if we just pick the right leader, things might magically change. The system depends on us not knowing what you know now. So what do you do with all this knowledge and all this information? I'm not going to give you false hope. I'm not even going to tell you that your awareness alone changes anything. I'm not going to pretend that if enough people watch this video, the tycoons will suddenly develop a conscience and the system will reform itself either. That's not how power works. But I'll tell you this, every system that has ever been dismantled started with people seeing it clearly. The American Gilded Age ended because the macrackers exposed the machine and the citizens organized. South Korea's democratic transition happened because people finally understood how the chaebol controlled everything and decided they had had enough. Every meaningful reform in history began with citizens who refused to accept the official story. And greatly, you are now part of that refusal. You cannot unfight this fight. You cannot unknow this truth. And whether you realize it or not, that makes you a problem for the people who designed this very system. Because the machine only works when it's invisible, when you cannot unsee it. And now, you all can see it. So, what do you do with that? And what you do with that is totally up to you. Maybe you share this video and help others see what you see. Maybe you support the few journalists trying to do the real investigative work. Maybe, you demand financial transparency from every candidate who asks for your vote. Maybe you organize with others who understand what you now understand. Maybe you build parallel systems of accountability that do not depend on institutions that have already been captured. Or maybe you do nothing. Maybe you file this away as interesting and go back to your merry life. That's a choice too. But you can never pretend that you do not know anymore. The investors have been buying our democracy for decades, treating our country like stock portfolio, extracting billions while we fight over scraps. They've built a machine so efficient, so perfectly designed that it extracts wealth from the states legally, systematically, and perpetually. And now you know it, and now you know how it works. The machine is finally in the open. It is visible. What happens next is not up to me. It's up to every person who sees what I've just exposed or shown you. The question is not whether the system can be broken. Systems are built by people. And what people build, we the people can dismantle. The question is whether we collectively, deliberately, relentlessly are willing to do the work, because they are counting on us not to. They are counting on us to watch this, feel angry for a moment, and then go back to normal, miserable lives. They're counting on our exhaustion, our cynicism, our belief that nothing ever changes, because nothing ever can change. They're counting on us staying blind. But Kenyans, we're no longer blind. And that changes everything. I've been your host, DY. Thank you for joining us. Please do share, continue to listen to our content. And we hope that this year we'll give out a lot more content. And again, we say Barakatele, and we hope that we see a better Kenya this year, as we proceed to next year's general election. God bless Kenya. God bless all of you, and have yourselves a good day, good night, good afternoon from wherever you are. I've been your host, DY.